Continuing on with our discussion of globalization, I would now want to move to this idea of the increasing interconnectedness of places. Remember, this is one of the most important threads of globalization that we're going to use over the course of the next few weeks. I've got exactly 4 examples that I want to discuss. Let's start out with this one. Probably a lot of you in the room are familiar with this very popular electronics commodity, and it's the iPhone. Let's talk about the iPhone a little bit. The iPhone is made by an American corporation, Apple, that has their headquarters in the Silicon Valley of California. So it's clearly an American corporation. Most of the software and the code that you will find on your iPhone that make it work was written in California. But your iPhone, if you own one, was not manufactured there. It wasn't assembled there. It was made in China, likely in a factory in South China. And then, of course, it was shipped across the Pacific Ocean to a port on the Pacific coast, and then probably taken by train to Chicago, where it was distributed to the rest of the Midwestern market. Now, I just want you to compare this idea of kind of a transnational commodity chain link with what probably existed 20 years ago. 20 years ago, if your parents had a landline, that phone, maybe manufactured by AT&T, was likely manufactured in the United States, and it didn't travel quite as far. But what it also means is that the United States today is much more connected to China than would have been the case 20 years ago. So let's look at the iPhone just a little bit more carefully and a little bit more closely. Let's start out with this. Almost all of the electronics commodities that we use here in the United States are manufactured today in a particular part of China. It's not all of China. Remember that China is a really big country. It's about the same size as the United States of America. But there's a region in China, and what that region is called is the Pearl River Delta. Basically, the Pearl River comes down from the interior of China, and where it meets the ocean, there's a really wonderful harbor. It's a deep harbor. It's a perfect place for large cities, for port facilities, and also a place that's therefore going to be really well connected, or at least likely could have the potential to be well connected to the rest of the world. Over about the last 20 years, this part of China has emerged as essentially the world's assembly line. They make everything here from iPhones to hair dryers to television sets and all sorts of electronic gadgets that basically make our lives a lot easier. Let's look a little more carefully at this particular map just to give you a sense of where we are. The green on this map is the city of Hong Kong, and right behind it is a really fast-growing new city called Shenzhen. It's a little hard to see, but it's S-H-E-N-Z-H-E-N. And then also notice this. There are 2 really gigantic modern port facilities. There's the Shekou Container Terminal and also the Hong Kong International Terminal. Behind these 2 cities of Hong Kong and Shenzhen, there's a vast area where you have medium-sized cities where a lot of these factories that make things like the iPhone are located. So let's kind of go through how the iPhone gets from China to the United States. Probably the easiest image to show and illustrate this is this one right here. It's a really large container boat right in the international harbor of Hong Kong, filled with these individual containers, probably filled with iPhones and other electronics commodities manufactured nearby. And that's going to take a journey, of course, across the Pacific Ocean, perhaps to the port of Los Angeles, where these individual containers will be loaded off, and then they'll be assembled into trains, which will be, of course, carrying those commodities to other parts of the United States, including the American Midwest. Now, what's interesting about this story is that every element of the technology here is basically new. These container ships are only about 30 years old in terms of when the technology was invented, but perhaps even more importantly, all those factories nearby are connected to the United States with internet technology, so that the Apple Corporation can communicate with the factories. If they couldn't communicate through, let's say, cell phones or the internet, they wouldn't likely have those factories something like 6,000 to 7,000 miles away. So it's a really good example of how technology produces this time-space compression, allowing a company like Apple to have a much larger footprint than it would have 20 or 30 years ago. Now, there's both benefits and drawbacks to globalization, but I would like to show some of the benefits. This particular part of China has become much wealthier than it used to be. 20 years ago it was quite poor, and this view right here is the city of Shenzhen. 20 years ago it was basically a small fishing village. Today, as you can see, it is a modern, industrial, large city that is studded with skyscrapers. Lots of new jobs, lots of new job growth. And so it's a part of China that's gone from basically being poverty-stricken to essentially middle class and dynamic, and very important in terms of its role and its connections to the outside capitalist world. So that's clearly one of the benefits. Globalization has led to development in this particular part of the world. Again, not all of China, but at least this one really important and strategic coastal region of South China. Now there are some drawbacks as well. This is another view of Shenzhen taken on what seems to be a foggy day, but it's not fog, it's smog. Those factories nearby operate in an environment where there really aren't a whole lot of environmental laws or regulations. It's one of the reasons why companies like Apple like to manufacture here, because they can do so with not a whole lot of red tape. Also, labor costs are much cheaper in China, and so companies like Apple can save quite a bit of money by locating factories there as opposed to, let's say, California. So the industrialization of South China has led to some really negative environmental consequences, like this really terrible air quality that you have during some of the year in places like Shenzhen. Let's move on to the second example of the increasing interconnectedness of places. This is a view of Midtown Manhattan in New York City, about 900 miles from southern Wisconsin. And even if you haven't been to New York City, I want to make the argument that we're all connected to New York City in ways that are new and very profound. Let me contrast our generation with, let's say, the people who lived in the 1950s. During the 1950s, people in the American Midwest likely did not have credit cards. Today, nearly everyone does. Not quite everyone, but a much larger percentage of the population than would have been true back in the 1950s. If you do have a credit card, whether it's Visa or MasterCard, the headquarters of those two corporations are right here, in the heart of New York City. And it's here in Midtown Manhattan where decisions about, for example, the interest rate that you pay and what kind of payment structure you're going to have, that's where these decisions are made. So even though we maybe have not visited New York City, we've certainly found that we're connected to New York in multiple ways. The same thing would be true if we had a view of Wall Street in Manhattan, because a lot of us, whether we realize it or not, at some point are going to have our retirements, our 401ks, or maybe our pension invested in Wall Street. And so what happens on Wall Street is going to have an effect on our financial livelihoods over the course of our lives. And that, although true for previous generations, it's even more true today because of time-space compression. So, even if we haven't been to New York, our lives and our livelihoods are basically connected to and even dependent on events and decisions that are made in New York City. I've got another example for you. Let's say you have that credit card, Visa or MasterCard, and you miss a payment. If you do, you'll likely get a polite call at first from the corporation asking you to make that payment. Well, today, that call could be coming from India. The reason it can be coming from India is because this particular fellow here, who is working in a call center somewhere in India, his computer and his telephone are connected to the United States with fiber optic cables, which make it possible to make these long-distance phone calls over thousands of miles, and they're still relatively inexpensive. 20 years ago, before fiber optic cables and before the internet, it would have made absolutely no sense for the Visa Corporation, for example, to have a call center in India, because copper wires would not have been able to handle all that information, and it would have been really expensive. But today, because of these new advances in communications technology, it's possible for Visa to close its call center in, let's say, suburban Chicago and reopen it in India, 8,000 miles away. Then they can take advantage of relatively low labor costs as well, and so the company becomes more profitable. So that's perhaps an advantage, but the disadvantage to globalization here is that the people who lose their jobs in suburban Chicago, of course, are going to view this event in a somewhat different kind of way. But the point is, we're connected to India. India is connected to us in ways that would not have been possible 20 years ago. Let's give just one final example. And this has really nothing to do with the economy, but everything to do with biology. So it's a somewhat different type of example than the other three that we've given. In this particular case, I want to think about the influenza epidemic. It happens every year. Sometimes it's no big deal. In other years, like for example in 1918, it kills quite literally millions of people. So, what we need to understand here is that the flu, over the course of about the last 100 years, has become global whenever there's an epidemic. Whereas before that time, influenza would have an outbreak, but it would be localized. You might have an outbreak here in, let's say, South China, but it would be localized. You might have an outbreak here in the eastern part of the United States, but again, 100 years ago, it would have been localized. Today, because every part of the world is connected to every other part of the world through the jet system, through regularly scheduled commercial jetliners, and there's really high levels of mobility and borderlessness, if there's an outbreak here in, let's say, East China, it's going to make it very quickly over to the United States, very quickly over to Europe, and then from there fan out to other parts of the world. So every epidemic these days typically is global, and that would not have been true back in the early part of the 20th century, and of course through all of the decades and centuries before that. Here's just another example of the exact same idea. Right now, public health officials and scientists are worried about bird flu. Bird flu is a particular type of flu, and it's right now a local epidemic, found really only in Southeast Asia, in parts of Thailand and Vietnam, to give just two examples. But the fear is that because we live in a globalized era, defined by time-space compression, defined by the increasing interconnectedness of places, that bird flu is going to jump out of its localized setting and become a global epidemic. It hasn't happened yet, but most people in the know who study this type of thing think that because of globalization, ultimately it may come to pass. And then finally, the classic case of a global epidemic, of course, is HIV. It's thought that HIV jumped from primates to humans about 100 years ago, somewhere in equatorial Africa. And it stayed localized in equatorial Africa for about 50 years. But then, not surprisingly, at the very beginning of the jet age in the 1950s and the 1960s, it began to spread to other parts of the world as we became more mobile, as places became more interconnected. And so today, there is really no part of the world that is immune to HIV. It's found everywhere, from Canada to Brazil to South Africa to China. And thus, the big point of the story here is that biology is as well, just like the economy, becoming more globalized. Places are more interconnected as a result of mobility, borderlessness, and time-space compression.